The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table for 11 days. Miriam Calloway, 83 years old, hadn't opened it yet. Not because she didn't know what was inside, she did. She'd watched her daughter Patrice slide it across the table with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who'd rehearsed the gesture 100 times in the bathroom mirror. She'd heard the prepared speech. The soft voice. The clinical language dressed up in love words. "It's a beautiful facility, Mom. They have a garden." A garden. As if a garden was a thing that could replace the 61 years she'd spent in this house. As if marigolds planted in someone else's soil could compare to the wild persimmon tree in her backyard that she'd watched grow from a stick her husband James planted the spring before he died. Miriam sat in James's old chair now, the brown corduroy one with the armrest worn thin on the right side, and looked at the envelope. Then she looked out the window at the persimmon tree. Its branches had gone gray and bare with October. But she knew it wasn't dead. She'd watched it go bare every October for 39 years. She knew what it was doing. It was just waiting. She picked up the envelope and walked to the fireplace. She set it on the mantel without opening it. Then she went to the closet beneath the stairs, the one nobody ever opened, and began to dig. It had started 3 months earlier, in July, when Miriam had left the stove on. It wasn't a fire. Nobody was hurt. The soup had simply boiled down to nothing and scorched the bottom of the pot, and the smoke alarm had shrieked, and her neighbor Gerald from across the street had called Patrice. That was the first domino. Then there was August. She'd confused her blood pressure medication with her allergy pill, an honest mistake, a half-second of inattention, and she'd sat down hard on the bathroom floor, not from a fall exactly. More like a slow descent. She'd been fine. Bruised. But fine. Patrice had arrived within the hour, and the look on her daughter's face, that particular mixture of love and terror and something else Miriam couldn't immediately name, stayed with her for days. She eventually named it. It was relief. Relief that the thing Patrice had been waiting for had finally started to happen. Not relief that her mother had fallen, no, she wasn't cruel. But relief that the world had finally agreed with the story Patrice had already been telling herself. That Miriam was declining. That there was a logical next step. By September, her son David had flown in from Phoenix. He was an architect. He walked through the house with the same systematic attention he probably gave to old buildings, cataloging problems, calculating structural risk. The loose bathroom tile. The step at the back door that had always sat a quarter-inch too high. The fact that the bedroom was on the second floor. They had a family meeting in her own kitchen. All 3 of her children, Patrice, David, and her youngest, Lawrence, joining by video on David's laptop, his face pixelated and earnest on the screen. They'd prepared documents. A list of facilities. 1 in Henderson, 1 in Summerlin. The one in Summerlin had a garden. Miriam had sat and listened to all of it. She'd eaten the slice of lemon cake Patrice had brought and said very little, because she understood that this was a kind of grief they were working through. They were grieving the version of her that didn't require maintenance. She could afford to be patient with that. She'd been patient with harder things. But after they left, after the laptop was closed and the kitchen cleaned and the last hug exchanged, Miriam sat alone in James's chair and felt something she hadn't expected. Not sadness. Not anger. She felt erased. Not by cruelty. That was the particular ache of it. By love. By the well-meaning architecture of people who couldn't see that she was still someone, still a whole. Continuous person with an interior life that didn't shrink just because her knees hurt and her memory skipped sometimes like a record with a scratch on it. She was still Miriam. She still had mornings where she sat with her coffee and felt genuinely glad to be alive. She still had things she hadn't finished. She just hadn't told anyone what those things were. Because some things you carry quietly. Some things belong to the part of yourself that you protect precisely because the world doesn't understand why it matters. What Miriam found in the closet beneath the stairs was a shoebox. Not unusual on its face. She had dozens of shoeboxes stored throughout the house, a lifetime of accumulation. But this one she recognized immediately by the faded green ribbon tied around it. It had been her mother's. Cora May's box. Miriam had placed it in that closet in 1987, the year Cora died, and she had not touched it since. She carried it to the kitchen table, not the table where the envelope had sat. She'd moved that to the counter, and she untied the green ribbon carefully, the way you'd unwrap something sacred. Inside was a collection of things that belonged to a woman Miriam had loved completely and understood only partially. A photograph of Cora in her 20s, standing in front of a car that was almost certainly borrowed. 3 letters tied with kitchen twine, the handwriting not Cora's. Miriam would examine those later. A worn leather address book. A small brass key on a loop of cord. And at the very bottom, folded into quarters and soft as cloth from decades of compression, a document. Miriam put on her reading glasses. It was a deed. Old, typed on a typewriter, stamped with the seal of Nye County, Nevada. Dated September 1961. Cora May Jessup. Owner. 47 acres in a place called Arroyo Verde Valley, outside a small town Miriam had never heard of called Mina. Miriam sat very still. She had no memory of her mother ever mentioning this. None. She'd been 22 in 1961, already married to James, already pregnant with Patrice. She tried to reconstruct that year, that version of her mother. Cora had worked as a seamstress. She'd lived in a small apartment in North Las Vegas. She'd been a practical woman with a quiet faith and a sharp sense of humor and no obvious connection to 47 acres of Nevada desert. And yet, there it was. Her name on a deed. Why didn't you ever tell me? Miriam thought. She looked at the photograph of young Cora standing in front of the borrowed car. The woman in the photograph had a small, private smile. The kind of smile that meant, I know something you don't. Miriam turned the deed over. On the back, in Cora's handwriting, in pencil, so faint it was almost gone, for when the time is right, baby girl. Miriam read it 3 times. Then she went to her computer. She'd been using computers since 1999, she was not helpless, and she searched for Arroyo Verde Valley. It existed. Small. Remote. Southeast of Mina, off a county road, high desert terrain. An elevation of about 4,000 feet. The satellite image showed a wide, flat-bottomed valley ringed by low mountains. Brown and gold in the Google Maps photograph, but she could see, or maybe she chose to see, something in the shape of it. Something open and unhurried. Something that didn't ask anything of you. She looked at the deed again. Then at the envelope on the counter. Then at her car keys hanging by the back door. She was 83 years old. Her knees hurt. Her memory skipped sometimes. She hadn't driven more than 40 miles from her house in the last 6 years. Mina, Nevada was 240 miles away. She slept on it. She slept on it for 3 nights, the deed and the small brass key on her nightstand where James's watch used to sit. On the 4th morning she woke up before the sun was fully risen, sat at the edge of her bed, and thought, if not now, then when? And if when, for what reason better than this? She packed a bag. She filled a thermos with coffee. She charged her phone. She put the deed and the key in her purse. She did not call her children. She drove. The first hour was fine. She knew the roads south of Las Vegas well enough, and the early morning light was soft and cool, and the coffee was good. And she felt something she hadn't felt in months, something so simple she almost didn't trust it. She felt like herself. But by the time she turned onto US 95 North, the highway narrowing and the landscape going austere and enormous around her, she began to feel the weight of the distance. Not physical weight, though her back was already protesting the car seat. A different kind, the accumulated weight of doubt. All the voices that weren't there but were somehow present. Patrice's voice, "Mom, what were you thinking?" David's voice, measured and architectural, "You can't just drive into the desert alone at 83. She turned the radio on. She found a station playing older gospel music and she left it there. She stopped in Tonopah for gas and used the restroom at a station that smelled like motor oil and old coffee. A young man behind the counter, maybe 19, looked at her with the reflexive concern people reserve for the elderly driving alone. And she preempted whatever he was about to say by asking him directions to Mina. He told her. She thanked him. She bought a bag of peanuts and got back in the car. It was somewhere between Tonopah and Mina, on a stretch of highway so empty the only vertical things were telephone poles and occasional Joshua trees, that she began to cry. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way you cry when you're not performing grief for anyone, just processing it alone in a place where no one can see. She was crying for Cora. She'd missed her mother for 36 years, but grief doesn't stay neat. It compresses and then expands again when conditions change. She was crying because she hadn't known about the valley. Because her mother had kept it secret. Because she didn't know why. Because she was 83 years old and still didn't understand her own mother completely, and that felt like both a loss and a wonder. She was also crying because she was afraid. Not of the desert. Not of the drive. Afraid that when she got there, it would be nothing. A vacant lot. An empty gesture. 47 acres of rock and brush that meant nothing and explained nothing, and she would have driven 240 miles to confirm that some questions don't have answers. She almost turned around outside Mina. She slowed the car. She sat on the shoulder of the road for 6 minutes. She ate some peanuts. She looked at the deed again. She looked at the key. For when the time is right, baby girl. She pulled back onto the road. The county road she needed was poorly marked, barely marked, in fact, just a rusted brown sign and a turnoff that didn't look like much. She almost missed it. She turned down a road that was graded gravel, her car protesting the surface, dust rising behind her in a low red cloud. The valley opened up gradually. First the road descended slightly. Then the mountains on either side began to feel closer and more deliberate, like cupped hands. Then the brush thinned and the floor of the valley widened, and she could actually see, that something had once been attempted here. The outline of structures. A collapsed fence line. What might have been a garden or a small orchard, the old trees still standing, gnarled and leafless now but unmistakably placed with purpose. And in the center, still standing, a small stone building. One room, maybe two. A low roof that had partially fallen on one side. A wooden door, swollen in its frame. She parked the car and sat for a long moment. Then she got out, and the cold mountain air hit her, clean and sharp and full of something mineral and ancient. Her knees ached on the uneven ground. She walked slowly. She didn't rush it. The door required the small brass key. The lock was stiff from decades. She worked it for 5 minutes, muttering, and then felt the mechanism give with a sound like a relieved sigh. Inside, dim light through one dirty window. Dust. The smell of stone and thyme and dry wood. A small table. 2 chairs. A narrow cot frame with no mattress. And on the table, as if Cora had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back, a mason jar, sealed, and inside the jar, folded papers. Her hands were shaking when she unscrewed the jar. The papers inside were dry and perfectly preserved. The mason jar had done exactly what it was designed to do, which was keep things safe across an indefinite stretch of time. Cora had understood that. She'd put these here knowing exactly how long they might have to wait. There were 2 documents. The first was a letter, 3 pages, Cora's handwriting, dated August 1961. The second was something Miriam didn't immediately understand. She read the letter first, standing there in the dusty light of the stone building while the wind moved quietly outside. "Baby girl," Cora wrote. "If you're reading this, it means you found the box, and you found the key, and you drove out here, and that means the time was right. I believe you'll know when the time is right. Some things can only be understood from a certain distance." Cora wrote about 1959. She wrote about a man named Franklin Jessup, not Miriam's father, who had died in Korea in 1952, but Cora's brother, Miriam's uncle Franklin, who had died before Miriam was born. Franklin had owned this land. He'd bought it with money saved over 15 years of working, because he'd believed, sincerely, with full conviction, that owning land was the only permanent thing a black family could do in America. You could lose a job, you could lose a house, you could lose dignity and standing and safety. But land that was paid for and deeded, that was real. That was yours in a way nothing else could be taken. Franklin had planned to build here. He'd started. The stone building was his. He'd come out on weekends, alone, and worked on it. He'd planted those trees along the eastern edge, apricots, Cora wrote, though she wasn't sure they'd still be alive. Then Franklin died of a heart attack at 51. He left no will, and no children, and no wife. And because there was no will, and because 1959 was 1959, there were people who moved to take the land in the legal chaos that followed. Cora had fought them. Quietly, without telling anyone in the family, because she didn't want to burden them with a battle they might have to watch her lose. She'd found a young black attorney in Las Vegas who'd worked the case for 2 years. And in September 1961, Cora had won. She'd put the deed in her name. She'd driven out here alone. She'd sat in Franklin's building and she'd cried, and then she'd written this letter. She'd never told Miriam because she'd never known how to explain the full weight of what it meant without sounding grandiose. Land. 47 acres of Nevada high desert that no one would ever think was valuable. But it wasn't about the value. It was about the fact that they had fought for something that didn't yield, and they had won. "I'm leaving it to you," Cora wrote, "not because your brother or sister don't deserve it. But because I always believed you were the one who needed to understand that some fights are worth more than what you can see. You were always the one who looked too hard at what you couldn't change. I want you to have something that proves that some things can be changed. Even the things that look settled." Miriam put the letter down. She couldn't finish it yet. She stood in the dusty room with her hand on the stone wall and breathed. She picked up the second document. It was a handwritten record, Cora's notes, about the legal case. The attorney's name. The arguments made. The counter-arguments. 2 years of work compressed into careful, precise handwriting. And at the bottom, a single line that wasn't part of any legal record. Franklin worked this land alone because he thought no one else believed. Don't make his mistake. Don't carry things alone that were meant to be shared. Miriam stood very still. She thought about the envelope on her kitchen counter. She thought about Patrice and David and Lawrence with their prepared documents and their careful voices and their love that had become a kind of management. She thought about the way she'd shut them out of her interior life because she'd told herself they wouldn't understand. Because she'd decided, quietly, without telling anyone, that she was facing the end of her life alone. Carrying it. Like Franklin. Like the secret of this valley. Like the shoebox under the stairs that she'd never opened in 36 years. She sat down in one of the 2 chairs at the small table. She stayed there for a long time. She drove back to Tonopah and checked into a motel. Her body required it, the day had been long and her back was done. She ate a bowl of soup at a diner that smelled like griddle grease and comfort, and she called Patrice. The call lasted 45 minutes. Patrice cried. Miriam expected that. But she didn't apologize for going, and Patrice, to her credit, didn't ask her to. What she asked, instead, what she said after the crying settled, was something Miriam hadn't expected. Mom, why didn't you tell us? About Grandma Cora's box? About any of it? We would have gone with you. That landed somewhere tender and necessary. Because the honest answer was, she hadn't thought they'd care. She'd looked at her children, successful, busy, forward-facing, and she'd decided for them that the past was not their concern. She'd curated herself for them. Given them the version that required least explanation. And in doing that, she'd accidentally made herself legible enough to be managed. She hadn't let them see the whole person. So they'd filled in the rest with worry. David flew into Reno 3 days later. He rented a truck. She was not driving that road again in a sedan. She agreed with him on that, and they went back out to the valley together. Lawrence joined them on video call from a rest stop somewhere outside Phoenix, his signal flickering, but his voice steady and present. David walked the property with the same systematic attention he gave to buildings, but this time Miriam watched his face instead of worrying about his conclusions. She watched him put his hand on the stone wall of Franklin's building. She watched him look at the apricot trees, 5 of them still alive, still standing, their bark silver and old but their roots undefeated. She watched the moment the land got into him the way land does when you're not prepared for it. We should fix the roof, he said. Not a question. A statement, the way architects make statements. She hadn't expected that either. They spent 2 more days out there. David took measurements, made notes, photographed everything. Miriam read the rest of Cora's letter, sitting in Franklin's chair, with afternoon light finally coming strong through the cleaned window. The letter's last page was mostly memory, Cora writing about Franklin's hands, the sound of his laugh. The way he used to bring her an apricot from this very grove when she'd come to visit him in the summer. She was just telling her brother back into existence, the way you do when you're old and someone has been gone long enough that you have to fight to keep them vivid. Miriam understood that now in a way she hadn't at 22. When they left, she looked back at the building from the truck window. The partial roof. The ancient trees. The valley floor stretched wide under an enormous sky, the low mountains gold in the late light. She felt something she needed several days to name correctly. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more specific than peace. It was continuity. The feeling of being connected to something that preceded her and would outlast her and was not, actually, finished. She was not finished. Back home, she called a family meeting of her own. Not in her kitchen, she was done with other people's staging. She called it in James's backyard, around the old picnic table, on a clear November afternoon with the persimmon tree bare and patient behind them. She brought coffee and she brought copies of the deed and Cora's letter, and she told them everything. She told them about the shoebox. About the 36 years she'd left it unopened. About the fear underneath that, the fear that some of her mother would disappear if she finished grieving her. She told them about Franklin, their great-uncle none of them had ever heard of, who'd bought land alone because he'd believed in something permanent. She told them what Cora had written in the letter, don't carry things alone that were meant to be shared. Patrice was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, Mom, I've been doing the same thing to you. She meant the nursing home plan. She meant the way she'd been managing a fear she hadn't voiced out loud, the fear of losing her mother, of watching it happen slowly, of being helpless. She'd turned that fear into action, into documents, into logistics, because logistics felt like control and control felt like love when you were scared. But she hadn't talked to her mother. She'd talked at her. The envelope from the facility went into the recycling bin. That was not the end of the conversation. Not even close. They talked for 3 hours around that table, through 2 pots of coffee and into the dark. Real things. Hard things. What Miriam needed practically, and what she was willing to accept, and what she wasn't. What each of them had been carrying alone. It wasn't resolved neatly. Families don't resolve neatly. But it was opened, finally. Aired out. Like a room that's been closed too long. 2 weeks later, Miriam was in the closet beneath the stairs again, returning the shoebox to its shelf, but emptied now, the document safe in better storage. The brass key on a chain around her neck, when she found something else she'd missed. Behind the shoebox. Pushed to the back of the shelf. A second box, smaller, with no ribbon. She didn't recognize it. Inside, letters. The ones from the shoebox, the 3 tied with kitchen twine that she'd set aside and never fully examined. She'd thought they were correspondence. She'd planned to read them eventually. She opened them now, sitting on the floor of the closet with her back against the doorframe, her reading glasses on, the light from the hallway just sufficient. They weren't correspondence. They were letters Franklin had written but never sent. Letters to people in the family, to Cora, to their other siblings, to his mother who'd been dead by then. He'd written them while he was working on the building, on weekends alone in the valley. He'd written about what he was building and why. He'd written, with a precision and a plainness that took Miriam's breath, about what it meant to own something in a country that had spent a century trying to make sure his family owned nothing. "I'm not building this for me," one letter said. "I've made my peace with the possibility that I won't finish it. I'm building it because someone has to start. Because when you start something and leave it well built, whoever comes next doesn't have to start from nothing. They just have to continue. And continuing is easier than beginning. Easier on the heart." Miriam sat on the floor of her closet and read all 3 letters twice. She thought about the word continue. She thought about the roof that David was already pricing out contractors for. She thought about Patrice, who'd called 2 days ago to ask if Miriam would be willing to share some of what she knew about Cora, share it properly, recorded. Kept, because Patrice had a 13-year-old daughter, Miriam's granddaughter Zoe, who'd never known Cora May and who should. She thought about the apricot trees that had survived in the valley without anyone tending them for over 60 years. Surviving not because someone came and saved them, but because their roots were deep enough and the soil was right and Franklin had planted them in the right place in the first place. Good work done in the right spirit outlasts the person who did it. That was the truth beneath the deed and the letter and the locked stone building and the preserved jar. It wasn't about the land. Not really. Cora had known that. She'd written it clearly, it wasn't about what you could see. It was about what you continue. Miriam thought about her life, all 83 years of it. She thought about what she'd built and what she'd planted. Not property. Other things. The way she'd taught her children to read before they started school. The quilt she'd made for every grandchild. The way she'd sat with James through his last year without allowing the dying to become the only thing in the room. The way she'd kept showing up, kept being interested, kept finding mornings worth sitting through. She'd been planting this whole time without knowing she was doing it. And now she had something specific to continue. She had a valley. She had a building that needed a roof. She had great-grandchildren who didn't yet know their own story. She had letters to share and a granddaughter who should hear them read aloud in her great-great-uncle's voice, preserved in pencil on old paper. She was not at the end of something. She was in the middle. Spring came early that year. In March, Miriam drove back out to Arroyo Verde Valley, not alone this time. David was driving, Lawrence had flown in from Phoenix, and Patrice was in the back seat with Zoe, who was 13 and currently recording everything on her phone because she'd decided, unprompted, that this was something that deserved to be documented. The roof was finished. David had found a contractor in Tonopah who'd done good work. The building stood solid and complete in the morning light, the old stone cleaned, the new timber on the roof the color of honey against the gray walls. The apricot trees were beginning to bud. Miriam stood in the doorway of Franklin's building, Cora's building now, hers now, theirs now, and looked out at the valley. The mountains cupped the morning light. The brush was still brown from winter, but the low green of early growth was beginning at the edges of things. The sky was that specific blue that only exists at elevation, a blue so clean it felt like a decision. Zoe came to stand beside her. She put her arm through her grandmother's arm, because she was the kind of 13-year-old who knew when to stop recording and just be present. "Did you know about this place your whole life?" she asked. "No," Miriam said. "I found it at 83. Zoe thought about that. "Doesn't that make you sad? That you didn't know sooner?" Miriam looked at the apricot trees. At the buds just beginning to open, small and pale and completely certain. "No," she said. "It makes me think the right time is real. And that you can't rush it. You just have to be ready when it comes." Zoe leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder. The morning was cold and clear and full of the particular smell of high desert in early spring, something mineral and green and alive underneath the cold. And Miriam Calloway, 83 years old, stood in a doorway her great-uncle had built and her mother had saved and she had driven to alone and her children had helped restore. And she felt, not despite her age but because of it, because of every single year of it, absolutely, completely, irreversibly whole. Somewhere right now, there is a box in someone's closet that hasn't been opened. There is a letter that was written for you specifically, by someone who loved you and didn't know how to say it simply. There is a valley, a place, a truth, a beginning, that someone started for reasons you've never been told. The question isn't whether you'll find it. The question is, when you do, will you be ready to continue?